Thank you very much for joining us. It's an honor to meet you. We're very excited to be interviewing you about your new book. Can you tell us a bit about how it came about, how you and Andrew came to write it together?
Yeah, I've known Andrew for a number of years. We've done lots of events together in the New York Historical Society, at the Clifton Literary Festival, even though I hadn't written a book, the Army Museum, and a variety of other places in the US and the UK. And Andrew rang me after the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022 and suggested that we should do a book together that provided the military historical context for Ukraine. And I jumped at the opportunity. I'd been looking for an opportunity, in fact, to write about Iraq and Afghanistan, both of which I obviously participated in a number of occasions, especially Iraq as a 2-star, 3-star, 4-star commander. And then he suggested that I also do the Vietnam chapter that was the subject of my PhD dissertation at Princeton, and then would shop back and forth the rest of it. And it turned out to be great fun. He's a brilliant historian, a great biographer, and frankly, a delightful individual with whom to work. And we had a lot of fun doing the book. And then we've had a lot of fun since then over the last couple of months on book tour together, although he just went back to the UK and I stayed in the US, although right now I'm in Madrid, Spain.
In your book, in the introduction, you introduce the idea of four key tasks for strategic leaders, and I thought that was fascinating. Again, can you take us through those?
Sure. This is an intellectual construct for strategic leadership. That's leadership at the very top. As we describe it, it's the civilian senior leader, President of the United States, Prime Minister of the UK. And then it's very importantly the military commander in the field who's taking the very broad, big ideas at the civilian level and translating them into a military campaign. A leader at that level has to perform four tasks superbly to prevail in conflict. The first is to get the big ideas right, to really understand the context, and to get the strategy right, the overarching big ideas. Then to communicate them effectively through the breadth and depth of the organization, and frankly, to everyone who has a stake in the outcome of the conflict. Then to oversee the implementation of the big ideas. This is what we often think of as leadership. This is the example that's provided the energy, the inspiration. It's attracting great people and developing them and keeping them. It's allowing those not measuring up to move on to something else. It's also very importantly how the leader spends his or her time. Nothing shows what's important to a leader more than, again, what's on the leader's schedule, the calendar. We termed it the battle rhythm when I was commanding in Iraq and Afghanistan. And then also the metrics that you use, which have to be rigorous. They have to be really well thought through, clearly defined, and then the sources of information for them have to be validated. And then there's a fourth task, which is sometimes overlooked, but should be on the individual's battle rhythm, on the schedule formally. And this is to determine how you have to refine the big ideas so that you can do all again and again and again. And again, in my battle rhythm during the surge in Iraq, for example, I had monthly meeting with the colonels that were the head of the lessons learned teams from the Army, Marine Corps, Special Operations, Asymmetric Warfare Group, Counterinsurgency Center, you name it. Weekly meetings with the strategic planners that forced me to make decisions on how we needed to refine the big ideas, the overarching strategy, the campaign plan, and a number of others. So those four tasks are absolutely crucial. The truth is that all leaders perform those four tasks. The difference is that the strategic leader, the leader at the very top, has to get the big ideas right. He is the leader who is going to make the fundamental decisions about the nature of the campaign and the strategy that will be employed to pursue the objectives that have been established by the civilian strategic leader. I should note that I actually used this explicit model during the surge in Iraq as the commander of U.S. Central Command, as the commander in Afghanistan, CIA director, and so forth. And we actually distilled this. There was a team. I was a non-resident senior fellow at Harvard for 6 years, one of the many academic endeavors I've had over the years. And there was a team there largely of former commissioned officers and serving commissioned officers in graduate school at the Kennedy School at Harvard who helped me distill this intellectual construct to a website that is at belfercenter.org. That's where I was a fellow. And if you search for Petraeus and strategic leadership at that site, it'll pop up.
And which of these four tasks do you find that military leaders fail at the most?
Well, as you went through the book, I'm sure you saw that military leaders don't always get the big ideas right. And it's crucial. And if you do not get the big ideas right, the chances of success are not particularly encouraging. We didn't get the big ideas right, I would submit, in Vietnam until over a decade after we'd been there. And by that point in time, the domestic support in the U.S. had eroded to the point there that it was no longer really possible to carry through to a successful conclusion. It was close, but not quite. In Iraq in 2006, the big ideas were invalidated. And so when we launched the surge, when I came back to Iraq for the 4-star command, we had to literally reverse the big ideas 180 degrees to go back into the neighborhoods from which we'd been withdrawing, to take back control from the Iraqi security forces of the security tasks, to reconcile with the elements, the rank and file of the insurgent groups and Iranian supported Shia militia, even as we intensified the pursuit of the irreconcilable leaders of those same insurgent groups, Iranian supported militia, and of course, Al Qaeda in Iraq, which we destroyed during the course of that 2007 2008 surge campaign and kept down, by the way, for subsequent 3.5 years until the withdrawal of our combat forces when the Iraqi security forces unfortunately took their eye off the Islamic State and it was allowed to reconstitute and eventually develop a caliphate. So again, there are a number of cases where the big ideas were crystal clear. You think of the first Gulf War. President George H.W. Bush says this will not stand at the very first meeting of the National Security Council. His military leaders understand that. That's clear. And they set up a prepped-in military campaign to destroy the Iraqi elements that were in Kuwait and to liberate Kuwait.
You mentioned Vietnam, and obviously, what didn't make it easy for the American forces is the massive mistake that the French made first.
The French had a seriously bad big idea. They could not bring the communists to battle. They were very elusive. They were guerrilla jungle fighters. And so they decided to build a big base at a place called Dien Bien Phu. And that would attract the communist fighters. It did. They lost, surrendered, and of course, the French had to leave Indochina. So again, we recount a number of cases in which it either took a very long time to get the big ideas right or other elements. It took 9 years after a brilliant initial campaign in Afghanistan to topple the Taliban when they refused to turn over Al Qaeda to us, and also to eliminate the Al Qaeda sanctuary in eastern Afghanistan where the 9/11 attacks were planned. But right after that, we took our eye off Afghanistan, focused on Iraq, and it took us 9 years to get the inputs right in Afghanistan. By that, I mean the right big ideas, the right overarching strategy, the right level of forces, the right organizational architecture, the structure, if you will, and all the elements needed for a comprehensive civil military counterinsurgency campaign, the right preparation of our forces, the right leaders, the right number of partners, diplomats, spies, development workers, rule of law, experts, and so forth. So again, many cases in which, again, we either didn't get the big ideas right or didn't change them rapidly enough, didn't keep them right, this kind of thing. And then other cases where, say, the British, together with the Sultan of Oman, in putting down the Dhofar rebellion, the British in Malaysia, the Falklands, Maggie Thatcher, again, very much like George H.W. Bush, this will not stand. And then the British military put together a campaign that does liberate the Falklands from the Argentinians who had taken it over. But it really is about big ideas. And I believe it's the Vietnam chapter where we quote Clausewitz, who says that the most important task for a commander is to understand the nature of the conflict. And that's crucial to then craft, of course, the right big ideas. For example, in Vietnam, we were most influenced by the lessons of Korea when the U.S. Entered Vietnam in the wake of the French withdrawal in the mid 1950s. And even though the South Vietnamese, by then, the North and South had been partitioned, the South Vietnamese leaders identified the real need was for what we would now call a counterinsurgency campaign in the hamlets and villages. The U.S. said, no, no, what you really need is big divisions like we had in Korea, because you should fear a North Vietnamese invasion of the South across the demilitarized zone. The truth is, the North didn't have that capacity then. The challenge was in the villages, but only the Marines, the U.S. Marines, got that right until 1968, when General Abrams took over from General Westmoreland and recognized what was needed. But by then, again, the challenges on the home front and in a variety of other ways, just the sheer inertia of a incorrect metric, for example, the body count and so forth, all undermined the prospects for that particular campaign, as did, frankly, the quality of the host nation leaders, who were more than a bit disconnected from those in the villages and hamlets and rice paddies.
Do you think our strategic leaders have the correct big picture now when you consider what we've got going on in Ukraine and in Israel and the Gaza Strip? Do you think, and elsewhere in the world, do you think we have that correct big picture?
In a general sense, yes, but there's a lot of other ideas that, again, we have to either refine or improve. I would submit that right now, with respect to Israel, I mean, the overall big idea there is very clear, that Israel is out to destroy Hamas and to dismantle its political wing. But I think it would be helpful if there were some additional big ideas announced, such as that the life of the Palestinians in Gaza will be much improved after Hamas has been destroyed, along with the Islamic Jihad, that Hamas is what has brought this violence on the people, and who will administer Gaza. If you take out the political wing and the terrorist army that is Hamas and the Islamic Jihad, who is going to govern, if you will, or administer, who's going to restore basic services, provide humanitarian assistance, begin the reconstruction of what is going to be enormous damage and destruction to civilian infrastructure. Uh, in my view, it has to be the Israelis, at least initially, in the interim, before there can be some kind of transitional international entity. Ideally, it would be a competent, capable Palestinian structure, but I think it's unlikely that the Palestinians want to be seen as riding in on the tanks of the Israelis to take over an entity, to take over Gaza from a group that defeated them in the elections of 2007. So the complexities there are not trivial, to put it mildly, but it would help, I think, for there to be an announcement about the day after, about the post conflict phase. We learned the hard way, actually. Our big ideas were inadequate for the post conflict period in Iraq after we got to Baghdad, toppled the regime. And then we compounded it with some seriously bad big ideas, firing the Iraqi military without telling them how we'd enable them to provide for their families, and then firing the Ba'ath Party down to a level that included the tens of thousands of bureaucrats we actually needed to run the country, without an agreed reconciliation process to enable them to come back into society and to help us out, frankly. In a general sense, I think we have certainly supported the Ukrainian effort in the way that we should. I'd like to have seen some of the decisions by the U.S. be made more rapidly, but the overall amount, $44 billion worth of security assistance alone, is enormous. And the U.S. has also led the way, together with the EU, UK, and other countries, to impose financial, economic, and personal sanctions and export controls on Russia. The overarching big idea for the most important relationship in the world, that between the U.S. and the West and China, I think is broadly correct. Obviously, to be firm, but uh, not needlessly provocative. But there, we need to transform our capabilities, our forces, to ensure that deterrence is absolutely rock solid. That capability. Remember, deterrence is a function of two elements. It's the potential adversary's assessment of your capabilities on the one hand, your willingness to use them on the other. And our capabilities do need to be transformed more rapidly from what simplistically can be described as a small number of large platforms that are incredibly capable, heavily manned, exorbitantly expensive, and also increasingly vulnerable to a massive number of smaller unmanned systems, some of which will be remotely piloted, others of which will be algorithmically piloted or guided, where the human in the loop is the human that, on the loop who actually writes the software that captures the conditions that have to be met by the machine before it conducts a kinetic or non-kinetic task. So again, in general, I think the general approach is reasonably sound, but I think that there's room for some substantial refinements and substantial improvements in the ways in which we are operationalizing the overarching big ideas. Not to, by any means, to overlook the enormous efforts that the U.S. is taking in the Indo-Pacific theater to harden our bases, to improve their defenses, to disperse the forces, to go underground with headquarters, all of these different initiatives that are on which we're spending at least 10 to 15 billion a year are actually quite important.
Yeah, and well, you're talking about all these quite complex initiatives when it comes to managing conflict. For example, the Israeli-Gaza conflict or the Ukrainian conflict, and afterwards we're going to have to work together to rebuild these territories. What happens when you have multiple big pictures? So you've got the people on the ground whose big picture is different to politicians, for example, in Washington, and then military strategic leaders who are on the ground as well. How do you reconcile that? How do you work together to manage different opinions and points of view?
The best example I ever saw and was fortunate to be engaged in was the surge in Iraq, where President Bush, when he named a new commander and new ambassador, also started a meeting on Monday morning in Washington from 7:30 to 8:30. By the way, any meeting before 9 or 10 in Washington is rare of that kind of formal nature. So the entire national security team is around the Situation Room table in the West Wing of the White House at 7:30 a.m. on a Monday morning. So on his battle rhythm, if you will, on his schedule, he showed what was important to him, spending an hour a week with us. And then on a subsequent day, he would spend an hour with the prime minister of Iraq, and the ambassador and I would attend that meeting as well. These were secure video teleconferences. And that ensured that there was absolute alignment between Washington and those in the field who were endeavoring to achieve the objectives, the very broad objectives that he had set out, but which left enormous latitude, frankly, for me and my team to craft the military campaign, the big ideas of which were, again, 180 degrees different from what we'd been doing in the previous year, when that strategy had been invalidated by the growing, essentially a civil war that had broken out between Sunni and Shia in the wake of a horrific Al Qaeda bombing of a sacred Shia shrine in a Sunni controlled area. And the cycle of violence that was growing and growing and growing invalidated the approach, but wasn't changed until the beginning of the surge in early February of 2007, and then was continued for the subsequent 18 months.
You speak about the war of warning or warning wars in your book, and also mention that that we don't do this as much anymore. We're doing it less than we used to. Do you think this has given hostile foreign states, so like Russia and whatnot, more confidence to invade territories that they perceive as their own, or territories that they legitimately could invade, because they don't see what used to be a united Western front being united anymore and being willing to commit to a proper response?
Well, I think that the way we have responded to the latest Russian invasion of Ukraine has been very substantial. The US and our NATO allies and the rest of the Western world have been very robust. We clearly need to continue that. And obviously, there are some challenges in the US domestic political front that may make that more challenging than it has been. But I think it will continue. And certainly the European support for Ukraine has been very robust as well. We believe, for example, that European countries have now contributed more in security assistance or pledged more in security assistance than the U.S. has pledged, and it had long been providing more in terms of humanitarian, economic, and financial assistance. I think generally, broadly speaking, the approach to China is appropriate. There's a glaring absence of a trade component when it comes to the overarching U.S. comprehensive integrated whole of governments with an S on the end policy. But again, I think quite sound in general, the trade component notwithstanding. And again, you can walk your way around the world. I think we're generally keeping an eye on Islamist extremist groups, albeit in support of other countries, whether it's in Iraq or with our Syrian Democratic Force local partners in that area, or with a host of different organizations and countries, forces in Africa and elsewhere. Deterrence on the Korean Peninsula, I think, is solid. Again, a host of other challenges. Obviously, Iranian-supported militias and proxies are very problematic, and that is Hamas, after all. It's also Hezbollah. It's also Shia militia in Iraq and Syria and the Houthis. Again, I think we're generally responding to that appropriately. I mean, we have two entire aircraft carrier task forces out in the greater Middle East right now. If you include the Eastern Med, we've beefed up our air power. We've beefed up force protection, counter drone, counter air and ballistic missile threats, and so forth. So again, I think in general that the approach has been quite solid. It's also heartening to see European countries spending more on defense, most specifically with Germany, which has pledged to spend 2% of GDP on defense now for the first time in a very long time, having not even reached quite 1.5 prior to the latest Russian invasion of Ukraine.
I did actually want to ask you about domestic, what's happening within the US at the moment. Do you, obviously, the war in Ukraine playing a significant part, are you worried about the increased sort of within the Republican Party, the increased isolationism? And of course, that was an issue just before Pearl Harbor. Is this something that concerns you as we draw closer to the next election?
Well, the fact is that there is a very strong bipartisan majority in the U.S. Senate. Both parties are strongly in favor of continued support for Ukraine and that for Israel, for that matter. The House, there is a bipartisan majority. The challenge is that an element in the Republican Party does give voice to these. I don't even know that it's isolationist would be correct. It's more that there's just not a support for continued aid to Ukraine. Because there is very strong bipartisan support for, again, being firm with China in a variety of different ways. So yeah, sure, that's a concern, and it's something that the administration and the bipartisan majority of both parties. I mean, arguably the strongest supporter of Ukraine in the entire Congress is the minority leader of the Senate, the Republican leader, Senator Mitch McConnell, who's been very strong on Ukraine from the outset and strong on, in general, on national security issues for the entire time that he's been in Congress, which is a very long time, as he's the longest serving Republican leader in the Senate in history. So again, yes, this is a reality. Individuals in the policymaking ranks have to deal with that, and the legislative ranks, I think they will. I think that support will continue. But it's certainly a reality that has to be concerning to those who believe, as I do, that supporting Ukraine, enabling Ukraine to the maximum extent possible to hasten the moment when Vladimir Putin realizes that the war is unsustainable, that is very desirable. But I can't predict when it will come. And frankly, right now, I think Putin believes that he can outsuffer the Ukrainians, the Europeans, and the Americans. And we need to help the Ukrainians prove that that assessment is incorrect.
Definitely. And closer to home, obviously the next election is coming up. Do you have any concerns about security at home in the US during the next election cycle? We obviously all know what happened last time on the 6th of January. Do you see that occurring again?
You don't. I think for a variety of reasons. One is that January 6th has already happened. Many of the leaders of that effort. Many of the rank and file as well are either in jail or have faced legal cases. And then a number of the other challenges to that election, those are all in court as well. So I think there's quite a significant caution there for anyone who might think of that again. That's not to say that there aren't those who believe the election was not free and fair and so forth. But again, I think in a vibrant democracy, we can deal with that. And I think the fact that something like this has happened, this is a little bit like a terrorist attack, that you have to be creative in
Yeah.
your estimate of what the worst case could be. And clearly there was both inadequate intelligence and inadequate preparation for that demonstration that turned into however you want to describe it, the insurrection of January 6th. Certainly the violence that was precipitated in the Capitol building itself.
Yes, and then so stepping back out of the US, in the next 12 months, how do you see the conflict in Ukraine playing out? Do you think we're anywhere near any kind of end game, or is this, are we in for the long haul?
I suspect it's more the latter than the former, but the only honest way to answer that is to say that it depends, and it depends on a number of different factors, not the least of which is the abilities of the respective sides to generate additional forces and capabilities, the possibility of Russian cracking or crumbling their forces, wrestling a bit, I'm sure, with morale issues, especially as you enter yet another winter. The Ukrainians know why they're fighting. They can look over their shoulder and see who they're protecting and understand that this is their war of independence, their war of survival. The Russians obviously look around and they see a lot of Ukrainians in occupied areas who hate them. There's that. Then there's also, will the level of U.S. and Western support continue? Can the sanctions evaders be tightened when it comes to the effort against Russia to bring the challenges to the Russian home front into higher relief and so forth? So, again, I think a number of different factors on which this depends. And in my view, we should be doing everything we can to help our Ukrainian partners to prevail in this conflict and to bring home to Russia that this war is unsustainable.